Hello and welcome back. Today I'm sharing a perspective with you on the topic of risk management. And as you would know, risk is something which everyone understands, and context is something which determines the utility and the end result of any risk management exercise you would want to do. So let us begin with initiating a risk management dialogue. Moving on with initiating a dialogue on risk management. Now, there are three ways you could get started with it. One of the ways is take up a framework, which is a standard framework, something like an ISO 31000 or a Coso framework. Pick up the definition and set the context with that definition. Second way is you can look around, pick up some risk management failures in similar businesses, and then quote those instances and pick up some of the practices which were not appropriate, which led to those failures. And that is another way to start with it. Third is you pick up some common knowledge, what people have experienced, what people have explained on different contexts, and then try and pick up something from that and build a story around it. So what I've done is basically taken the third approach rather than going by a framework or going by, risk management failures, examples of those risk management failures, which I believe would be a sort of a, some sort of a negative context to start with having a dialogue with stakeholders. So let's begin with taking one of these examples. Let's say you pick up the first one. It says the line between disorder and order lies in logistics, and it was said by Sun Tzu. And Sun Tzu was the chief strategist in the Chinese army. Now, if you look at from a perspective that you're wanting to start a dialogue in a logistics company, for them, the supply chain is the most important aspect. That is where they've built their entire business model. And if you look at where this saying was, contextualized, it was contextualized by the army general with context to getting the resources to his soldiers who are fighting on the front lines. If those soldiers do not get the necessary and adequate resources on time, then it is just a matter of time that they will die on the front lines fighting with the enemies. So the point here is, you can pick up anything like a, you know saying or a quotation or something like a storyline and then build on it. You can, always bring in the framework as a next step. We can look at one or two more of these, and these are just some common and famous sayings on risk management that I've taken. Let's take another one. Green light, stop. If you want to see where you are taking the most risk, look at where you are making the most money. It was said by Paul Gibbons. Now, this sort of a, thought process will resonate most with the entrepreneurs and promoters of a company, because for them, once they have invested their capital, once they have invested the money, for them, the biggest risks are typically where their money is invested. So they want to know what is happening with that, what is happening with the investments. We can have a look at another one. And it was said by Michael Porter, one of the most famous people working on strategy. Risk is a function of how poorly a strategy will perform if the wrong scenarios occur. Now, this is a fantastic definition and a very practical one. Now, in any business, if you were to find out the strategic risk, you look at the strategic objectives of that business. Once you understand the strategic objectives, you lay down the risks and the wrong scenarios or the possible unfavorable outcomes, you'll come up with a list of risks for those particular business. And then you can build further on this by taking a framework. Let's say you decide to take the Coso framework. Now, Coso framework will say that you divide the risk, or identify the risks in four quadrants: strategic, financial, operational, compliance. And the way you start it with is looking at the objectives on each of those strategic, financial, operational, and compliance aspects. So that is another way. You pick up a thought and then you build it with a framework, then you create a story around it. Let's take another one. Never take both hands off the pump. As an entrepreneur, you need to be on the constant lookout for opportunity, and that will involve risk. But you minimize those risks by keeping one hand on the pump that is producing for you. Now, if you look at last 1.5 years, the way COVID has shaped up, I think within this same period, there has been a lot of risk for a lot of companies, if not all companies, and there have been opportunities for few companies. Let's say businesses which had a business model driven by IT. They saw the opportunity and they were able to scale their operations using that technology. And let's say take a simple example of something which is non-technology. Let's say example of a sugar industry where ethanol is a byproduct. So those companies also realized that they could use their byproduct and create a new product which is hand sanitizer, and that also has a huge market in the next 1.5 or 2 years or 5 years. So you look at a business and you identify the opportunities along with the risk, you look at the threats, you look at the vulnerabilities, and you take decisions to come up with new things. So again, you can contextualize these kind of thoughts within the business and then build on the framework, or bring in the framework into the picture. Let's take a look at the another one. The essence of risk management lies in maximizing the areas where we have some control over the outcome while minimizing the areas where we have absolutely no control over the outcome. Now, again, if you look at the COVID example, it's an external factor that has caused risk to the business, and that is something which is out of control for every company. Now, if you look back, all businesses have been challenged with the same risk, which is COVID. Even though it's a kind of a black swan event, it has challenged every business model. Now, this particular thought process says that you maximize the areas where you have some control over the outcome. Now, if you look at the technology companies, they have control over their service, they have control over their product. Now, they could come up with remote solutions because they have some control over the outcome, but they have absolutely no control over COVID. So that is another aspect which you can use or you can contextualize and bring in the framework. Let's take at the last one on the page. Risk and time are opposite sides of the same coin. For if there were no tomorrow, there would be no risk. Time transforms risk, and the nature of risk is shaped by the time horizon. The future is the playing field. Now, this is one of the best that I would say on the given page. If you look at the phrase that says time transforms risk and contextualize it within the same risk of COVID, you would realize that within the first 2 to 3 months in 2020, let's say March, April, and May in India, COVID was seen as a risk which is causing lockdowns, which is causing problems with respect to mobility. And there were no serious health issues which had appeared at that point in time. It was a risk which was supposed to be managed in a particular way by, let's say, all companies and all countries. But as time went by, COVID became a typical, risk which would threaten any company to its existence. There have been companies which have shut down, and time has totally transformed the COVID risk because the virus has mutated. A lot of people have got infected, and the efficacy of the vaccines is still something which is a matter of concern for a lot of people. So I think this sort of a phrase you can also use, or some lines wherein you can start with a thought process and then contextualize in a business. Let's say if you were to be working on a healthcare business, then this sort of a line or a phrase will work best for that kind of a business when you have to set the context for risk management. The larger point here is you pick up a thought and you build on that thought so that the business and the stakeholders are able to relate to it. The point is not that you take a framework and you narrate the definition. I think everybody would go through the framework and go through the definition. But relating to the business and the business scenarios is something that will drive your agenda forward. And that is the point that I want to make through this slide and few of the examples that I've taken. Let's move ahead and we'll further contextualize these points and look at few other aspects and how you can build on your dialogue or your context on risk management. Moving on. So far, what we have seen was more like a monologue where it took a thought process and tried to contextualize it with a framework and try to fit into a business scenario. Now, let's say you want to take that forward and start a dialogue with the management. So knowing your prospective client or the stakeholders is the most important aspect if you want to initiate a risk management dialogue. So let's say I've defined 4 aspects which you need to keep in mind, to begin a risk management dialogue. The first and the most, I think, important one is perception about risk management. Whether you look at it in a context of strategic risk management, financial risk management, operational risk management, or compliance risk management, different personnel will have different perceptions about all of these. Let's say talking to a chief operating officer, so you would talk more on operational risk management. Talking to the CFO, you will talk more on the financial risk management. Talking to the CEO, you will talk more on strategic risk management. Talking to the board of directors, you will talk more on strategic risk management and financial risk management. And talking to the chief compliance officer or a chief legal officer, you will talk more on the compliance risk management. So knowing the perception of the board of directors, the audit committee, the CEO, the CFO, the CXOs, all of these key stakeholders, their perception about risk management and how you can, work through that perception. And in some cases, you might even be challenged to break that kind of a perception that exists in a particular company. So you never know. You have to be prepared and you have to know your prospective client and stakeholders. And perception is one of the most important elements. Second, definition. How would you define risk management? Whether you use a Coso framework or an ISO framework or NIST or ICAI or any other framework. So there are lots of frameworks available. Like we discussed on the previous slide, you can, pick up a thought process, build a story using a framework and then contextualize in the business. So definition is most important. And the reason I say it, because when it comes to risk management, one of the most important elements is tone at the top, and how it gets communicated to all levels in the organization will be the key to setting up the risk culture. And that will happen only if people across all levels have some sort of a common understanding, and they speak the common risk language. So definition is also very important. Third, complexity of the business model, the business process, the operations, the technology, the geographies in which the business operates, the customers that it deals with, the suppliers, or the performance parameters that it has, let's say productivity, accuracy, response time, and so on and so forth. Now, this is one aspect which will vary from one business to another. You have to be very mindful when you study the business model, when you study the business operations, when you study what sort of a technology is driving that business or enabling that business. So you'll be able to then contextualize better as far as risk management is concerned. So there might be instances, some businesses might be very, very prone to cyber attacks, or they will be very severely impacted by, let's say, a risk relating to intellectual property because they are dealing with their own intellectual property and the client intellectual property. So you'll have to be very mindful of the complexity of the business and the business model and the business processes. Last but not the least, change. Driving change from the status quo and addressing the resistance to change. So it's very natural for human beings to resist something which is new because it's changed from the status quo and it is taking people out of their comfort zones. So risk management might be seen as a compliance issue by many companies, and many employees in a company might still see it as additional work. And that is where the culture of the risk management has to be understood. And that is where, like I said on the previous point on the definition, that tone at the top will determine what sort of a culture that you see in that organization. So again, change management, again, this will be very much dependent on the culture that exists. The point on these all 4 aspects is that when you have to contextualize risk management and when you have to start a dialogue on risk management, you have to keep these points in mind. These are very important aspects. And whenever you are dealing with, let's say, CEO, CFO, CXOs, and board and the audit committees, and you can always use the framework for guidance. So those are, and these frameworks are very fantastic frameworks. But, like I said on the previous slide as well, contextualizing it in a particular business is something, which will enable the business and the stakeholders to relate to the topic more, and that is where you'll drive the agenda forward. Now, moving on, once you've set the business context, the next step is, creating an agenda around risk management. How will you move forward? You've identified the context, you've set the context. Now, you need to discuss with the management and the stakeholders about the need for risk management. People will be asking questions. What is the need for something new that you're doing? So you have to explain them through the needs and the benefits of risk management. So these could be the two good starting points to build on the existing culture on risk management, or if it is being done for the first time, creating the right sort of awareness so that people know that this is the need, these are the benefits, and it is not just a compliance issue. It has more to do with the business, how you take decisions in the business, how you contextualize your entire strategic, financial, operational, compliance objectives. Then once you've defined the needs and benefits, then it comes the risk management responsibilities. Who owns the risk management piece, and how it gets delegated down below in the organization? Again, that has to do with the culture. Once you've evaluated the culture, then defining these responsibilities through either a policy or a procedure document or through a simple chart. I think you can do that whenever you're doing an awareness session. Then something around how risk management will mature in the organization. A lot of companies would still see risk management as a compliance issue, at least in the India context. And you have to kind of, like I spoke on the previous slide, work through the perception, or sometimes break the perception, existing perception, and work with the CEO to create a better culture and better tone at the top around risk management. So you'll have to have some sort of a roadmap around how the risk management practices will mature. Then initiating the risk management, some steps around it so that the people understand the process, how it works as a process. Then some sort of a plan around rolling out the risk management policy, procedure, assessment templates, or whatever you are planning to do in that particular business. So next steps for discussion with the stakeholders, and then some samples around risk management, that these are the sort of templates that people will be working on, and these are the sort of assessments that people will be doing, be it impact analysis, be it probability assessment, be it grading of risk between high, medium, low, be it linking the risk to the strategic, financial, operational, compliance objectives, be it putting those onto a map. So that totally depends on how you've contextualized, how you have defined, and how you've kind of discussed with the stakeholders about the entire risk management exercise, or how you plan to discuss. So this could be some sort of a overall plan where you can have different steps, different phases, different milestones to the entire exercise. So this is just an illustration. You can create your own agenda. You can have your own sort of flexible slide. You can have your own topics within that. How you contextualize within a particular business will determine how you roll forward this kind of a thing in a particular business. Moving on and taking one example from the previous slide, it said risk is a function of how poorly a strategy will perform if the wrong scenarios occur. Let's take an example. There is a board of directors and they've laid out the vision, mission, goals, objectives, strategy, business plans, annual operating plans. Now, what they've basically done is determine the strategic objectives based on the appetite in a particular business. And there are two concepts around appetite. Let's say one is risk capacity and second is appetite in the business. Take one example, simple example. I have 100 rupees in my pocket and my capacity to lose money is 100 rupees at that particular point in time. And now if I invest that 100 rupees into 5 different investments, starting with, let's say, gold, mutual fund. So I have appetite for different investments, which is, let's say, 20 rupees each for all the 5 types of investments. Now, my objectives are fixed. One of my primary objective is to maximize my returns on my investments. So anything that prevents me from maximizing my returns on the investments will be a risk for me. And how do I define tolerances in that? Let's say for the particular investment of 20 rupees in a mutual fund, I decide that my tolerance is 2 rupees for a loss. So the moment the value of the mutual fund goes to 18, I will change my decision, risk decision, which might be moving that particular investment into a safer investment, which might be gold at that particular point in time, because I want to protect the value or maintain the overall return on my portfolio of investment. That is one way of looking at it. Second is, let's say you have the vision, mission, goals, objectives, and strategy. Now, all risks in your business will be linked to your objectives, whether those are strategic, operational, financial, and compliance. And within those, you will have tolerances with respect to each of the risk items. And based on those tolerances, you will have risk decisions. Whether you accept a particular risk, whether you transfer it, whether you reduce it, or you avoid it. Let's take the simplest of examples. You want to drive your vehicle on the road. So there is an inherent risk of an accident happening on the road. What do? First things, when you are going on the road, you are accepting certain degree of the risk by driving. Second is, there is a approach to transfer the risk. And what part of the risk you can transfer is probably the financial part in it. We all know insurance as a product. Whenever we purchase a vehicle, we take an insurance, pay a certain premium, that if an accident happens on a road, the financial loss due to that accident will be made good by the insurance company, and that is how you transfer the risk to the insurance company, and that is the financial risk that you have transferred. And how do you reduce it? Let's say the vehicle that you have has brakes. You train your driver, you know when to apply the brakes, not to overspeed, because you know overspeeding can cause accidents. You keep internal controls, so you reduce or mitigate the risk through internal controls. You define policies in your business. You create your decision based on risk and risk information. And last, avoid the risk. How do you avoid a risk? You do not go on the road with your vehicle. So that is a complete avoiding the risk. So once you've determined the risk management techniques that you'll be using to, kind of meet your established risk tolerances, there'll be a feedback and input which will go at the end to, again go back and define the plan or the strategy or the goals for the next year. So it is a cyclical process wherein you understand the inherent risks associated with the business and achieving this strategy in the business and objectives in the business. Bottom line, all risks are linked to your objectives, and the way to identify the risk is to understand the objectives in the business, and those objectives will be in all four categories: strategic objectives, financial objectives, compliance objectives, operational objectives. So this is one simple representation and an example, couple of examples. I took the example of 100 rupees and investing it and making it to taking the investment portfolio to 200 rupees. And I've taken another example of how to accept, transfer, reduce, avoid the risk by taking the example of a vehicle. Depending on the nature of the business that you're working on, you can have as many examples as you want. But to again, going back to the point that I mentioned in the previous slides, to understand and to drive home the agenda, you have to contextualize risk management. Again, 4 points that I mentioned on the previous slide: how you work through the perception, what is the perception of the management, how you define it, then what is the complexity of the business, and then lastly, how the change management happens. So these are some of the points just to give you a perspective that whenever you want to start a risk management exercise, do contextualize in terms of the objectives, in terms of the strategy in the business, in terms of the plans, in terms of the objectives around compliance, operations, and financial risk management. And you have tolerances around each of those. Then you have measures around performance, and you have your risk decisions, whether or your risk management strategies, whether you accept a risk or you transfer a risk, reduce a risk, avoid a risk. So this is just one pictorial representation. If you want a complete sort of a presentation, that is available on my LinkedIn page. You can easily download the PDF And if you need further discussions, you can always reach out over LinkedIn and we can have a discussion around the topic. I can share more details around it. These are simple examples. You can create your own examples depending on the customers or the stakeholders you're dealing with, or you can, just contextualize it completely differently, keeping in view whether you're working in India or outside India. I think in the Indian context, large part of mid-sized companies, they treat risk management still as a compliance issue, and that is where you have to break the perception, drive home the agenda, make the stakeholders go through the objectives and sort of impact analysis. And once you quantify those kind of things, I think this is a topic which is going to be much appreciated, and it has already started to coming up more in discussions, especially after the COVID scenario. So that is one example. I hope you find it useful and I hope you find it relevant. So you can follow our page on LinkedIn. You can follow my channel on YouTube. If you need more content on risk management, governance, compliance, internal audit, internal controls, you can always write in over an email. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for watching this. Thank you so much once again, and please feel free to share your feedback on the content on LinkedIn or YouTube. And if you have any suggestions, you want any particular topic to be covered, please feel free to mention through a direct message on LinkedIn or reach out over WhatsApp or Instagram or YouTube itself. Thank you so much once again. Take care.